So thank you so much. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. As Bill remarked, I think often enough, and Reinhard did too, Birgit was silent about that. I'm an economist, and this is slowly like turning into a help group for alcoholics, but instead of with alcoholics, with the economists, you expect people to stand up and go like, we love you, Jesus, even when you're an economist. But I belong to those type of economists that are even willing to talk to other disciplines. So there are very few of us. And most of us think that all of the social sciences are nested within economics. It's just that they have not discovered about it yet. I think that we can still learn something from other sciences. And that's why I'm going to be talking basically about economics, but also about demography and also about political science. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing at the World Population Program for the last more than 5 years now, on how human capital and mostly educational differences across age groups and across genders affect economic growth and development in a more general sense. As I said, this is part of a research agenda that has been developing for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and that has included input from a lot of demographers, from a couple of economists, and from a couple of political scientists and sociologists. So I can only give you just a small glimpse on all the work that we have been doing. The basic research paradigm behind the work that we have been doing is based on the fact that we think that by monitoring changes in human capital, and with that I mean exactly this idea of human capital being population augmented with the characteristics of that population, so moving away from a homogeneous population to a heterogeneous population. Economists tend to think about it in terms of skills, but in general, we think about it in terms of different characteristics. So that by monitoring the changes, we think that we are able to explain differences in economic outcomes across countries and over time. And we think that we can also gain a better insight into the nature of the way that economies adopt technology and help themselves grow in terms of income per capita in the long run. If it is the case that we can find those links, and we believe that we have found it several times during our work in the last years, then we can also use the existing projections of population by age, gender, and educational attainment in order to create sensible projections that can be then used for policy advice, getting back to the central topic of the conference, which is this interface between science and policy. And I'm going to show you actually some of the projections that we have been using for eventually being utilized in estimating greenhouse gas emissions as part of the current IPCC round. I think that the premise, I think that the paradigm that I just described sounds kind of intuitive. However, economists have had a very, very, very hard time trying to really find an empirical link between education and economic growth. And the reason being that when you ask an economist what they think that education does to people at a macroeconomic level, they would go like, yeah, I learned in micro that people who are more educated get a higher wage. And they get a higher wage, most probably, I hope, because that's all I learned in micro, because they have a higher labor productivity. So if you just take a simple standard economic growth model and just assume that you have people with different productivities, labor productivities, according to the level of education, you're not going to be able to really find within the framework of those models very much of a relationship between education and economic growth in the long run. Because you need to take into account some other effects that education has and that are not as straightforward and simple explanations as the one that the microeconomists would give you. The most important being that education helps you innovate, helps you create new technology, and helps you adopt foreign technologies if you're a lagging country. So it helps you converge in terms of income per capita. It helps you catch up with the technology frontier. This is one of the ways that have taken us closer to understanding the link empirically between education and economic growth. The other being the fact that the data that we have been using until recently was not really optimal for having a look at the education growth link, mostly because they tended to aggregate measures at a full population level, forgetting about the heterogeneity across individuals and the fact that human capital, like physical capital, usually only an economist could think about that, but human capital, like physical capital, also has vintages. So it's not the same using a technology of a given year than using a technology which is more modern or closer to the current technological frontier. And that's why having a look at the full distribution of age, of population by age, gender, and educational attainment, here you have an example for Kenya in the year 2000, can help you understand why societies are able to grow or unable to grow in a much better way. You have here the red bars correspond to people without education, the yellow bars correspond to people with primary education, light blue is for people with secondary education, and the dark blue are for people with tertiary education. You have the age structure, you have males to the left and females to the right. And as you can see, the older generations in Kenya for the year 2000 look completely different from the new generation. So if you want to explain how economic growth is expected to take place in the country, taking the average over all those years with having a lot of uneducated people outside of the labor force is probably not the best idea. You would need to really have a look at the age dynamics that are evolving over time. Usually, until very recently also, we only had like one photograph of this type of pyramid for each countries of the world. And it has been thanks to the work at the World Population Program here at IIASA that we have been able, using back projection methods, to recover basically all population pyramids with the extra dimension of education for basically all countries of the world as of today, back to the 1970s. Here you have the pyramid for Kenya, the population pyramid for Kenya going back to 1980. And by just feeding these extra dimensions of information into economic growth models, we have been actually able to understand better how the process of economic growth is taking place. And we have understood also that the effects of different education levels at different age levels and its interaction plays an extremely important role to understand how growth takes place. For example, one of our most important results is that tertiary education at young ages meaning in terms of labor participation, so we're talking about groups up to 40 years old, that tertiary educated people in those age groups are fundamental when it comes to creating and adopting new technologies, while secondary education in developing economies is giving you this extra labor productivity touch. So you need to basically balance those out on those two out on your way to higher levels of development. The good thing about demographers is that they tend to have one variable named age. We have heard about it in the conclusions of Vegat's presentation, that tends to affect us pretty much the same way. So in 1 year, I can be sure that everybody in this room will be 1 year older. And by doing that, actually, that implies that with a couple of assumptions concerning enrollment rates and eventually migration and mortality differentials across age groups, you can also create relatively sensible scenarios when it comes to projecting populations by education, age, and sex in the future. Here you have the example for an extrapolation of the global education trend existing at a global level right now for Kenya, going back to the year 2050. You have this beautiful effect of the demographic transition, reducing fertility rates that is already visible by the year 2050. And by feeding that into our projection type of model, into our economic growth model, we can also create projections actually of economic growth. This is just as an example, the GDP of the whole world in the 5 different shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios of the current IPCC round. So it's basically the only information you need to create this, apart from some assumptions on the accumulation of physical capital, is just population dynamics, and population dynamics that go back to exactly the dynamics of those pyramids that you saw before, which gives us a very consistent setting in which delivering advice to policy, in this case, for environmental issues. Now, our results clearly show that there is a clear relationship between education dynamics, again, in the full demographic structure, and economic growth, but we have moved even a couple of steps further, having a look at how human capital dynamics affect not only economic growth and economic outcomes in the most strict sense, but also social outcomes in general. An interesting graph that maybe some of you know about, but that tends to make people very aware of the importance of education is this one. What you have in here, each point of the scatter plot is a country for the year, an average of the year 1970 to 2000 for all countries of the world. What you have on the x-axis is the average years of schooling, and what you have on the y-axis is an index of democracy. It's the Freedom House indicator for political rights, which can be interpreted as something like the degree of democracy in the country. And as you can see, there is quite some, just by looking at the unconditional correlation, it's not a big story behind it. There's quite a strong correlation between countries getting more educated, if you want to interpret it this way, countries getting more educated and becoming more democratic over time. There's a lot of microeconomic evidence about more educated people being more willing to participate in political processes and having a higher demand for participative processes. If you take that at a macroeconomic level, you would expect also that countries that increase their education or that improve their education in terms of educational attainment would also eventually become more democratic. We did a study on that, and that's actually the case. And there's much more behind this black box. So there's not only an overall global effect of the educational attainment level of countries, but also an extremely interesting interaction between female and male education, with basically closing the gap between female and male education being very, very robustly related to democratization processes in the world. Let me wrap up. We have, I hope, well, again, there are like 1,000 papers behind all this, so if you want the nitty-gritty details, you will have to read them. But I think that it's a good conclusion that we have found that actually human capital dynamics are indeed a variable that can explain differences in economic, in the economic potential of countries and in the economic outcomes across countries, and that on top of that, following population dynamics understood with this dimension not only of gender and age, but also of educational attainment, can be a crucial piece of information when it comes to informing not only development policy and not only environmental policy. In the framework of the IPCC, we are seeing ourselves doing that, but also for explaining and predicting eventually future institutional change and social change at the political level. Thank you.